Everyone in Bitterwell said the same thing the morning Della Suttree drove her wagon out onto the salt flat. She won't last a season. She had $11 folded into the lining of her coat, a sick ewe, and 40 head of half-starved sheep nobody else would buy, and a deed to 2,000 acres of cracked white ground that 3 different men in town had already called the worst land in the Arizona Territory. The flat lay south of town, like a spilled bag of flour, blinding under the early sun, salt crust splitting in long gray seams that went all the way to the foot of the Dragoon Mountains, and not one green thing grew on it that a person could see. The clerk who handed her the deed had not even charged her the recording fee. He had just looked at her over his spectacles and said, real quiet, like he was doing her a mercy, that she could still tear it up and walk away clean. She did not tear it up. She put it in her coat next to the $11, and she went and got her sheep. I want you to remember her name, because by the end of this, you are going to want to remember it. Della Suttree, 24 years old, widowed 8 months, with a dead husband's debt and a dead husband's dream, and not one soul in the territory who thought she could do anything with either. If you are the person who likes a story where the whole world is wrong about somebody, and that somebody just keeps her head down and proves it, do me a favor right now and tap that like button, leave a comment, and tell me what town or city you are listening from. I genuinely read them, and I like knowing who is out there riding along, because what Bitterwells did not understand that morning, what nobody understood for a long while, was that the salt flat was not a curse. The salt flat was the whole secret, and Della Suttree was the only person within 100 miles who had the patience to find out why. She had come west from Missouri with her husband Tom 3 years before, the two of them with a wagon and a notion that the territory was full of room for people who were not afraid of work. Tom Suttree had been afraid of nothing, which is a fine quality in a man until the morning a horse rolls on him in a dry wash and he does not get up. After that, Della had been afraid of a great many things, but she had learned, the way the grieving learn, that fear is only weather. You can stand out in it. You can keep walking through it. It does not stop you unless you decide to lie down in it. And Della Suttree had never once in her life decided to lie down. The deed had been Tom's. He had won it in a card game in Tucson from a man who was glad to be rid of it. 2,000 acres of salt flat that the previous 3 owners had each abandoned in turn after a single bad year. The first had tried to run cattle on it and lost the whole herd to a winter when the grass would not come. The second had tried to dig for silver and found only more salt, white and useless, crusting his picks. The third had not even unloaded his wagon. He had ridden out, looked at the flat for an afternoon, and ridden back to town and signed the deed over to the first fool who would take it, which had turned out to be Tom Suttree with a good poker face and a bad sense of what land was worth. Tom had meant to do something with it. Tom was dead. So now it was Della's, and the $11 were Della's, and the 40 sheep were Della's, and Bitterwells gave her until the first hard freeze. Bitterwells was not a kind town. It was not a cruel one either, not in the way some frontier towns turned cruel, but it had the particular hardness of a place that had watched a lot of people fail and had stopped wasting its sympathy on the next one in line. It sat at a crossing of 2 freight roads in the dry country between the San Pedro and the Dragoons, a single street of false-fronted buildings, a mercantile, a bank no bigger than a chicken coop, a saloon called the Drover's Rest, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and maybe 200 people who all knew each other's business and most of each other's debts. The men who ran it were the men who ran most such places. A banker named Horace Pell, who held more paper on more homesteads than anyone liked to think about. A cattleman named Augustus Cray, who ran 4,000 head on the open range north of town and considered every blade of grass between the mountains to be morally his, whether he held the deed or not. And a freight contractor named Lucius Ward, who hauled goods up from the railhead at Benson and had opinions about everyone. These three men did not agree on much, but they agreed on Della Sutry. They agreed she was a fool, they agreed she would be gone by Christmas, and they agreed, in the comfortable way men agree about a thing that costs them nothing, that it was a shame about the husband, but you could not save people from their own stubbornness. The first time Della heard one of them say it to her face was the morning she came into the mercantile to buy fence wire. She had counted her $11 3 times by lamplight the night before, and decided she could spend 2 of them on wire and tacks if she was careful, because 40 sheep on open ground without a fence were 40 sheep that belonged to whatever coyote or rustler came along first. She walked into the mercantile with her list and her $2, and Augustus Cray was standing at the counter with his thumbs in his vest, a big sunburned man with a white mustache and a voice that filled a room whether you wanted it to or not. "That's the Salt Flat woman," he said, not to her, to the storekeeper, but loud enough that there was no mistaking who he meant. "Heard you bought sheep, Mrs. Sutry." Sheep! He said the word the way another man might say a disease. "You know what sheep do to grass. They crop it down to the dirt and pull the roots out after. A cattleman won't run sheep within 50 miles of his range, and you're going to run them on the flat." He smiled under the mustache. "There isn't any grass on the flat. So I suppose you've solved the problem of sheep ruining grass by buying ground that hasn't got any. That's the cleverest thing I ever heard." There were 3 or 4 men in the store, and they laughed because Cray was a man you laughed with if you knew what was good for you. Della set her list on the counter. She was a small woman, brown-haired, with a plain, square face and pale gray eyes that did not waver, dressed in a man's canvas coat over a faded blue work dress, because the coat had been Tom's, and it was warm. She had learned that raising your voice in a room full of men was a way of handing them the argument. "I'll take 6 rods of the smooth wire and a paper of tacks," she said to the storekeeper, "and a pound of the yellow soap." Then she looked at Cray just once, square. "You're right that there's no grass on the flat, Mr. Cray. I noticed that, too." And she paid her $2 and took her wire and walked out, and the laughing trickled off behind her because she had agreed with him, and somehow that was worse than arguing, though none of them could have told you why. She drove her wagon out onto the flat that same afternoon, the wire and the tacks and the yellow soap rattling in the bed behind her, and the 40 sheep strung out behind the wagon in a dusty gray thread with the sick ewe carried across her knees, because the ewe could no longer walk. The flat got bigger the farther out she went, the way a thing gets bigger the longer you look at it, and the town fell away behind her until it was a smudge of false fronts against the north horizon, and there was nothing in the whole white world but the wagon and the sheep and the pillar of dust, the wheels kicked up, and the red rock shelf away to the south that she was steering for. It took her until almost dark to reach it. She made her first camp in the lee of that red rock with the last of the light going copper across the salt. And she penned the sheep in a rough brush corral and laid the sick ewe down on a sack near the fire, and the ewe died in the night, quiet the way they do. And in the morning, Della carried it out a quarter-mile onto the flat and left it for the coyotes, because the ground by her camp was too hard to dig, and she did not yet know that the ground anywhere on that flat would fight a shovel like a living thing. So her first morning on the salt flat, she had 39 sheep and a dead one out on the white and $11 less the two she had spent. And she stood in the cold dawn with her breath smoking and looked at the great blinding nothing she had bought. And she turned her back on the direction of town and went to work on the corral, because standing there looking at nothing was a thing you could do on your own time after the sheep were safe. What she did instead was work. There is a thing about a person who has decided not to lie down, which is that the work becomes a refuge, something to crawl inside of, so the grief and the fear cannot get at you. And Della crawled inside the work that first week and did not surface. She strung her 6 rods of wire into a proper corral against the rock so the coyotes could not have the lambs. She found in a fold of the red rock shelf a seep, a bare weep of moisture out of the stone where a few stunted grasses grew, not enough to water a flock, but enough to wet a rag. And she understood from that seep, before she ever drove her iron rod into the flat, that this country held water somewhere if you were stubborn enough to ask it the right way. She walked the sheep out onto the edges of the flat in the early mornings, where a thin growth of pickleweed and iodine bush, salt plants, grew in the seams, and the sheep ate them, cautious at first and then greedy. And Della watched her flock eating salt plants on cursed ground and began that first week to do the arithmetic in her head that no one else in the territory had ever bothered to do. Lucius Ward came by the second week, the freight contractor, and that was the first time anyone from town came out to look at her, and it was not kindness that brought him. Ward hauled the south freight road that skirted the flat, and he had seen her smoke, and he reined his big freight team off the road and came rocking across the hardpan to her camp to see, he said, if she needed hauling, but really to get a look so he would have something to carry back to the drover's rest. He was a lean, stooped man with a tobacco-stained gray beard and quick eyes that went over her camp and her sheep and her wire corral, counting, pricing, filing it all away. "Setting up to stay, are you?" Ward said from the wagon seat, not getting down. "Most folks that come out here, they come out to look, and they don't come back. You're the first I ever saw unload the wagon." He spat. "You'll want hauling time to time. I do the South Road twice a week. I'll carry your wool to Benson, you ever get any wool, and I'll bring you out flour and such for a fair rate. Cheaper than you driving it yourself." "What's the rate?" Della said. Ward named a rate. It was not a fair one. It was a rate set for a woman alone who he figured had no choice, half again what he charged the homesteaders east of the flat, and Della knew it, because Della had asked the homesteaders what Ward charged them on her way through that country with the sheep, the way she asked everyone everything, quiet, filing it away the same as he did. "That's half again what you charge the Hardens," Della said. "I'll pay the Hardens' rate, or I'll drive my own wool to Benson, and it's 4 hours each way for me with a wagon and a whole day's freight for you. So you tell me which of us can better stand to lose the trade." Lucius Ward looked at her a long moment, and something shifted in the quick eyes. Not respect exactly, not yet, but a recalculation, the look of a man who has set a trap and found the rabbit reading the spring. "The Hardin's rate," he allowed at last, grudging, "for wool. Flour out is a nickel more, account of it's uphill loaded." And that was a fair point, so Della took it, and they had a deal, and Lucius Ward drove off across the flat and carried back to the Drover's Rest not the story he had come for, but a different one, that the Salt Flat widow had haggled him down to the homesteader's rate before he was halfway out of his wagon, and the men at the Drover's Rest laughed at that too. But it was a slightly different laugh, the laugh of men who have heard a thing they did not quite expect. Della Suttree did not know it, but she had just made, in Lucius Ward, the first of the small alliances that would one day come to her rescue, and she had made it not by asking a favor, but by refusing to be cheated, which is a thing hard men remember longer than kindness. What none of them knew, what Della herself only half knew yet, was that she had not bought the Salt Flat to grow grass on it. She had bought it because of something Tom had said once, lying in their wagon under the stars in the first month they came west, when he still had the deed folded in his shirt and big plans behind his eyes. He had said that the man he won it from told him a thing as they shook hands. The man had said, real low, half ashamed, that there was good water under that flat. Sweet water deep down, the kind that does not come up salty, that the salt on top was old sea bottom, ancient, dead, but that somewhere underneath it the country had buried a spring that nobody had ever managed to reach, because everyone who tried gave up and walked off and called the place cursed. Tom had laughed when he told her, because it sounded like exactly the thing a man would say to make worthless land sound like a secret. But Della had not laughed. Della had lain there and thought about it, and she had gone on thinking about it for 3 years, and now Tom was in the ground, and the deed was in her coat, and she meant to find out whether the man had been lying. So that first season was not about sheep, not really, though everyone thought it was. The sheep were just a way to keep eating. 40 sheep gave her wool and lambs and the occasional mutton, and a few of them she could trade in town for flour and coffee. And that was how she planned to stay alive while she did the thing she had actually come to do, which was find the water. She set up her camp at the north edge of the flat, where a low shelf of red rock rose out of the white, the one bit of ground on the whole place that was not salt, and she pitched Tom's old wall tent against the rock and built a brush corral for the sheep, and she started to walk the flat. She walked it for a month. Every morning she left the sheep penned, and she walked out onto that blinding white ground with a canteen and a long iron rod Tom had used for setting fence posts, and she pushed the rod down into the salt crust every dozen paces to feel what was under it. Mostly it was more salt, then hardpan, then the rod would not go any deeper. But she was not looking for soft ground. She was looking for a particular thing her grandfather had taught her to look for back in Missouri, a man who had witched wells for half the county with nothing but a forked peach branch and 50 years of paying attention. Her grandfather had not believed in the peach branch. He had told her once, winking. He believed in the lay of the land. Water ran downhill, even underground, he said. It pooled where the rock dished. You found the low place that the eye could not see. You found where the old dead plants grew greener in a dry year. You found where the dew lay longest in the morning, and you dug there. And most times you were right. The salt flat looked flat. That was the joke of it, the thing that had beaten 3 owners before her. To the eye, it was a dead level plain. But Della was not using her eye. She was walking it at dawn before the heat came up, and she was watching where the thin morning mist lay last before it burned off, and she was kneeling in the gray seams and tasting the crust, because salt is not all the same salt. And where the crust tasted faintly bitter instead of clean, it meant minerals were moving, and where minerals moved, water had once moved too. By the end of that first month, she had walked off a place near the center of the flat, 1.5 miles from her camp, where 3 things were true at once. The mist lay there last. The crust tasted bitter, not clean. And when she pushed her iron rod down, she felt it go through the hard pan into something softer below, something that gave the way ground gives when there is moisture deep in it, holding the grains apart. She drove a stake there and tied a strip of red flannel to it so she could find it again, and she stood and looked back at her little camp shimmering against the red rock 1.5 miles off. And for the first time since Tom died, something in her chest opened a crack, something that was almost like hope. Then she went back to her sheep, because hope does not feed 40 head, and a coyote had been at the corral in the night. There is a thing I have to tell you about that month of walking, because it was not the empty grind it sounds like. And Della Suttree was not a woman who let a single day go by without learning one true thing from the ground she stood on. Every morning the flat gave her something. One dawn she found, half buried in a salt seam, the bleached jawbone of a cow, one of the cattleman's herd from years before, and she turned it over in her hands and saw the teeth worn to nothing, and understood that the beast had died not of thirst, but of starvation, had ground its teeth down to the gums trying to eat grass that was not there, and she set the jawbone on a rock by her camp as a reminder of what the wrong animal got for being stubborn on the right land. Another morning she found a man's boot, just one, cracked and curled by the sun, sticking up out of the crust like the flat had swallowed the rest of him, and she left it where it was, but she stood over it a moment and said to herself that she would not be a third thing on that flat. And one morning, the best morning, kneeling in a gray seam to taste the crust, she found a thing that changed how she walked the rest of that month. It was a shell, a small white spiral seashell, no bigger than the end of her thumb, lying in the salt crust 40 miles and 1 mile high from any ocean in the world. And Della Suttree, who was not an educated woman but was a watching one, held that shell in her dirty palm and understood the whole secret of the salt flat in a single jolt, the way you understand a thing all at once that you have been circling for weeks. The flat had been a sea. Long ago, longer than she could think about, this whole white plain had been the bottom of a sea, and the salt was the sea's dried bones. And a sea bottom holds water the way nothing else on earth holds water. Deep down in the old drowned ground, sweet water trapped under the salt like a secret under a lid. She kept the shell. She carried it in her coat pocket next to the deed and the dwindling dollars for the rest of her life. And on the morning the water finally came up sweet, she would take it out and look at it. But that is ahead of the story. What the shell did that day was tell her she was right to dig. Up until then she had been going on a dead man's drunken hint and her grandfather's lay of the land and the bitter taste of the crust, which is to say on faith and a tongue, and faith and a tongue will get a person started, but they will not get her through 40 feet of fired clay. The shell gave her the other thing, the thing underneath the faith, which was a reason. The sea had been here. The water was here. She had only to go down and get it. She walked back to the red flannel stake at the center of the flat with the shell in her pocket, and she stood on the exact ground where the mist lay last, and the crust tasted bitter, and the rod went soft, and she scuffed a square in the salt with her boot heel, 4 feet on a side, and she said out loud, to the flat, to Tom, to herself, "All right then." And the next morning she put the spade in. I'll tell you about the digging, because the digging is most of that first year, and it is where Bitter Wells decided, finally and for good, that Della Suttree was insane. She could not afford a well driller. A driller wanted $40 to bring his rig out from Benson, and she had $9 left after the wire and the soap and a sack of beans. So she dug by hand. She had a shovel and a pick and a long-handled spade and a windlass. She built herself out of a freight axle she bought from Lucius Ward for 50 cents, and she dug a hole in the middle of the salt flat with her own 2 hands, a hole 4 feet square, and she went down into the white ground 1 bucket at a time. The salt crust came off in slabs. Under it was the hard pan, gray and tough as fired brick, and she broke it with the pick a chip at a time, and under the hard pan was a clay so dense it came up in plugs that rang when she tapped them. She went down 4 feet the first week. She went down 9 the first month. She rigged the windlass over the hole and lowered herself down on a rope every morning and filled the bucket and climbed out and hauled it up and dumped it and climbed back down all day in heat that stood over 110 on the flat by noon until she could not lift her arms. And then she went and saw to the sheep and slept like the dead and got up and did it again. Lucius Ward saw the hole first. He came hauling freight along the South Road one afternoon and saw the little figure out on the white with the windlass and the growing mound of gray spoil beside it, and he reined in and watched a while, and then he drove on into town and told the Drover's Rest that the Salt Flat widow had gone and started digging a well in the one place in the whole territory where God himself could not put water. The men at the Drover's Rest enjoyed that. It became a thing they said. A man who was wasting his effort on anything, a man bailing a leaky boat or courting a girl who would not have him, was said to be digging a well on the Salt Flat. It got around. By midsummer, children in Bitter Wells were saying it. Horace Pell, the banker, said it to Augustus Cray over a glass of whiskey, and the two of them laughed. And Cray said the only good thing about it was that when she finally gave up and walked off, he might be able to pick up the deed for back taxes and run a few head on the Red Rock shelf, which was the only part of the place worth a nickel. 60 feet. That was the number the driller from Benson had laughed at when she had asked him, before she gave up on hiring him, what depth he would expect water at on ground like that. He had said 60 feet if she was lucky, and she would not be lucky. Nobody was lucky on the Salt Flat. And he had charged her nothing for the opinion because he liked to think of himself as a generous man. 60 feet. Della wrote the number on the inside of her tent flap with a charred stick, and every evening when she climbed out of the hole, she measured the rope against a mark on the windlass and figured how deep she had gotten, and she crossed off the foot she had gained. 56 feet to go. 51. 44. She was tearing that number down 1 foot at a time with a pick and a bucket, and the stubbornness the territory had not yet learned to respect. The hole tried to kill her twice that summer. Once the clay above her head sloughed and dropped a slab the size of a tabletop into the bottom of the shaft a foot from where she knelt, and she went up the rope faster than she had ever moved in her life, and sat on the lip of the hole with her heart going like a hammer and her hands shaking, and then she climbed back down and shored the walls with cottonwood poles she hauled 4 miles from the San Pedro, because there was nothing else to do but quit, and she was not going to quit. The second time was the bad air. She had heard old miners talk about it, the dead air that pools at the bottom of a deep hole and snuffs a candle and then snuffs the man, and one morning her lamp guttered low at the bottom of the shaft, and she felt her head go light and swimming, and some animal part of her that was smarter than her tired brain hauled her hand over hand up the rope before she even understood why, and she lay in the dirt at the top, gulping clean air while her vision came back. After that, she lowered a lit lantern first every morning and watched it, and if the flame ducked and dimmed, she did not go down until she had fanned the shaft out with a wagon sheet on a pole. The flat did not give up its secret easily, but Della Sutry was patient in a way that frightened people who met her, the patience of a person who has already lost the thing she was most afraid to lose and found she is still standing. The water came at 41 feet on a morning in late September, and it did not come the way she had imagined it. She had imagined, in the soft part of her mind she did not let out much, that it would come up sweet and cold and clear, and she would cup it in her hands and weep. What actually happened was that her pick went through a seam of harder rock into softer ground beneath, and the bottom of the hole turned to dark mud, and the mud filled the bottom of her bucket, and she hauled it up and looked at it, and it was wet, just wet, gray mud. She put her finger in it and touched her finger to her tongue, braced for the salt, and it was not salt. It was flat and mineral and faintly sweet, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted in her life. She went back down and dug another 2 feet in the rising mud, the water coming faster now, seeping in cool around her boots, and by the time she climbed out for the last time that day, there was a foot of standing water in the bottom of her well, and it was rising, and it was sweet. She did not tell anyone. That is the part that matters, and it is the part that tells you what manner of woman she was. Any other person, half mad with a year of digging and a town full of mockers, would have ridden into Bitter Wells that very night and stood up in the Drover's Rest and told every man who had laughed at her to come out and taste the water. Della did not. Della understood something about the men who ran that town that they did not understand about themselves. She understood that the moment Augustus Cray and Horace Pell learned there was sweet water under the salt flat, the salt flat would stop being worthless, cursed ground that nobody wanted and start being the most valuable land in the territory, and a widow with $11 and a hand-dug well would not get to keep it. There were too many ways for men with money and lawyers and the sympathy of the county to take a thing away from a woman alone. So she said nothing. She capped the well with planks and covered the planks with salt crust so it looked like more flat, and she let Bitter Wells go on believing she was digging a dry hole in cursed ground, and she went quietly to work on the real thing, which was the thing the water made possible, which was the thing nobody in 100 miles had thought of, because nobody in 100 miles had ever looked at a salt flat and seen what Della Sutry saw. What she saw was this. Sheep do not need much. Sheep need water, which she now had, deep and sweet and endless, and sheep need forage, which the flat did not have, But here was the thing the cattlemen never understood because they ran cattle, and cattle are stupid about salt. Sheep love salt. Sheep need salt more than cattle do, and a flock that has to be hauled salt blocks and driven miles to mineral licks is a flock that costs money and loses condition. But a flock standing on 2,000 acres of natural salt with sweet water coming up out of the ground in the middle of it was a flock that would never founder, never go salt-hungry, never lose a lamb to the white scours that came from poor minerals. And the salt did one more thing, the thing that turned out to be the whole fortune. Though Della did not know it yet that September, the salt killed the foot rot. It killed the worms. It killed the wet ground diseases that destroyed sheep on the lush bottomland the cattlemen prized. Della's flat was dry and clean and salty and lethal to every parasite that plagued a flock, and with the well watering them it was, though no one in the territory would have believed you if you said it out loud, very nearly the perfect ground for sheep. Before I tell you how she built it, I have to tell you about the winter the well nearly cost her everything anyway, because the well coming in sweet did not end her troubles. It only changed them. The first winter after the water came, a man rode out to her camp on a cold, gray morning, and it was not Lucius Ward, and it was not a homesteader. It was Horace Pell, the banker, in his black coat, on a good horse, picking his way across the frozen flat with his gloved hands folded on the saddle horn. And Della watched him come, and her stomach dropped, because a banker does not ride 4 miles out onto cursed ground in winter for the pleasure of the air. "Mrs. Suttree," Pell said, and he did not get down either. None of them ever got down, as if setting a boot on her ground would have cost them something. He had a soft, careful voice, a voice that had foreclosed on a great many homesteads without ever once raising itself. "I'll come to it. You took a freight account with Lucius Ward, and Ward carries paper at my bank, and a man came through last fall, a well driller out of Benson, who told a story in the Drover's Rest about a salt-flat widow who asked him the depth of water on cursed ground. He let that sit. Now nobody believed him, because there's no water on the salt flat. Everybody knows that. But I am a careful man, Mrs. Suttree, and careful men notice when a woman who can't feed 40 sheep keeps a freight account current and buys cottonwood poles by the wagon load. So, I'll ask you plain, have you found water? And here is a place where Della Suttree showed you the steel that was in her, because she was alone in winter, with the most dangerous man in the county sitting his horse over her, and she neither flinched nor lied in a way he could catch her in. "I've got a hole in the ground, Mr. Pell," she said, which was true. "I've been digging it a year. You're welcome to ride out and look at it," which was a dare, because the hole was capped and salted over and looked like more flat, and she knew he would not climb down off his good horse and pry up planks in the cold on the word of a drunk driller. If I'd struck water on the salt flat, don't you think the whole territory would know it by now? I'd have shouted it from the church steps. A widow with water would be the richest woman in the county. She let a little bitterness into it, just enough. The bitterness of a woman who has dug a year for nothing. "I've got a dry hole and a freight account I pay on time and 39 sheep that aren't dead yet. That's my whole fortune, and you're welcome to audit it." Horace Pell looked at her a long time with his careful eyes, and Della made herself meet them flat, and the lie held, because it was wrapped around enough truth that he could not find the seam. At last he gathered his reins. "Well," he said, "a careful man asks, You'll forgive me." And he rode off, and Della stood in the cold until he was small against the north sky, and then she sat down hard on a salt slab and shook, because she had just learned that the secret was not a thing she could keep forever by saying nothing. The driller had talked. Pell was watching. The clock was running, and it would run for years before it ran out, but it was running, and Della Suttree went down into her capped well that very afternoon in the cold, and she worked twice as hard and twice as quiet as before, because now she knew exactly what she was racing. There is a thing I have to tell you about how alone she was through these years, because it is easy to tell a story like this as if competence is its own company, and it is not. There were nights out on that flat, the wind coming down off the dragoons cold enough to crack the water bucket, the sheep huddled, and a coyote yipping somewhere out in the dark, and Tom 3 years gone, and 4 years gone, and 5, when Della Suttree sat by her little fire in the door of the wall tent and was as lonely as a person can be and not die of it. She talked to the sheep. She talked to Tom, sometimes out loud, told him what she had done that day, told him the salt bush was spreading, told him the lambs had come clean, and the talking helped. And it also did not help the way talking to the dead never quite does. She got the dog that same hard winter after Pell's visit. Buck, a half-grown black and white pup she bought from the Mexican herder Thomas at Benson for $1, and Buck changed everything, because a dog is company, and a dog is 1,000 eyes for a flock, and a dog loves you with a completeness that no town ever will. But the thing that bound them to the bone was not the dollar or the purchase. It was a night in February when a blizzard came down off the dragoons, a wet, heavy snow that the dry country saw maybe once in 5 years, and the sheep, stupid as sheep are, drifted before it and piled into a fence corner and would have smothered the bottom ones crushed under the top ones the way a panicked flock will pile and kill itself. And it was the dog, not yet full grown, who went into that storm in the dark and worked them, barking and nipping and circling, holding the flock off the fence until Della could get out there with a lantern and break them apart. Somewhere in the black and the snow the dog went down a wash and could not climb out, and Della heard him crying and went down after him on a rope and carried him up against her chest, and the two of them lay in the tent the rest of that night, soaked and frozen with the storm screaming outside, and she held that shivering dog and wept into his wet fur, and the dog licked the salt off her face, and in the morning the storm was gone and the sheep were alive. After that night, Buck did not work the flock because she trained him to. He worked it because it was theirs, his and hers, and there is no fence and no wage that makes a creature loyal the way one bad night together makes it loyal. From then on, Buck slept in the tent door, and Della was, for the first time in a long time, not entirely alone. I want you to hold on to the loneliness of those years before the dog, because it makes what comes later mean what it means. She built it slow, through that fall and into the winter, while bitter wells forgot about her because there were other things to laugh at. Della took the water, and she changed the flat 1 acre at a time. She did not try to make the whole place green, which had been the mistake of the cattleman before her, who broke himself trying to turn salt into pasture. She did something cleverer. She fenced a paddock near the well, and she hauled in cottonwood and willow cuttings from the river, 4 miles each way in her wagon, and she planted them in a long windbreak along the north fence, where the well water could reach them through shallow ditches she dug by hand. She planted 4-wing saltbush, which she dug up wild from the foothills, a gray, scrubby plant that cattle would not touch, but that sheep ate greedily, and that thrived of all places in salty ground. She let the salt bush spread. She watered it from the well in the dry months, and it grew, and the sheep ate it. And where the sheep ate and dunged the ground around the well began, very slowly, to change. The first spring there was a fringe of low green around the paddock that had not been there before. The second spring it was wider. Sheep manure and well water and salt bush, year on year, were doing to the dead flat what no plow and no prayer had managed, and Della Suttree, who told no one anything, watched her 2,000 acres of cursed white ground begin at the edges to come alive. The flock grew. 40 became 60. 60 became 90. 90 became 140 by the third spring, because sheep on good, clean, salty ground with sweet water and salt bush forage do the things sheep do, which is multiply, and they did it without the losses that ate up every other flock in the territory. Della lambed them in the dry paddocks, where no foot rot could touch a newborn, and she lost almost none, and her wool came off heavy and clean and white, because there was no mud and no burr and no parasite to ruin it, and twice a year she loaded the wool clip into Tom's wagon and hauled it up to the railhead at Benson herself, and sold it, never once, through anyone in Bitter Wells. And so Bitter Wells had no notion of how much she was getting for it, which was a great deal more than they would have guessed. Let me take you on one wool trip to Benson, because it tells you how the secret money grew and how careful Della was about it, and because it is the trip on which she first learned that the world outside Bitter Wells did not think she was a fool at all. Twice a year she loaded the clip, sometimes 30 fleeces, sometimes 60, pressed tight into wool sacks taller than she was, and she hauled them the long day's drive to the railhead at Benson, and she did not sell to the first buyer who offered. She walked the clip to every buyer on the platform, and she pulled a fleece from the sack and shook it out, so the buyer could see what she already knew, that there was no burr in it, no second cut, no dung tag, no rot, that it was the cleanest white wool that came to that platform out of the whole dry country, and she made them bid against each other for it. The first time she did this, a buyer named Sheffield, a fat, shrewd man who bought for a Boston house, watched her shake out a fleece and rubbed it between his fingers and looked at her sharp. "Where's this from?" he said. "I buy half the wool in this territory, and I never saw a clip this clean. Bottomland wool comes in here full of rot, and the upland comes in full of burr. This is neither." "It's from a salt flat," Della said, "south of Bitter Wells." Sheffield laughed. "There's no wool grows on a salt flat, ma'am. There's nothing grows on a salt flat." "There's this," Della said, and shook the fleece. "So I expect you'd best revise what you know. Now do you want it, or do I walk it down to the Tucson buyer, because he's been after me 2 trips running?" Which was true, and Sheffield, who knew clean wool the way Cray knew cattle, stopped laughing and made her an offer, and another buyer heard it and bettered it. And Della Suttree stood on the Benson platform in her husband's canvas coat and sold her salt flat wool for a top price to men who could not believe where it came from. And she took the coin in gold and silver and not in bank paper, because bank paper led back to Horace Pell. And she drove home across the dark flat with the money in a sack under the seat, and she buried it that night in the strong box under the well house floor with what was already there, and the buried fortune grew clip by clip, year by year, while Bitter Wells went on believing she was scraping by. That is how the $300 came to be in the ground under the well house. Not luck, not a hidden mine. 6 years of the cleanest wool in the territory, sold hard and kept quiet, one buried clip at a time. Let me linger on one thing she built in those middle years, because it is the thing that turned a hand-dug hole into a working ranch. And it is the thing that finally made even Lucius Ward stop calling her the Salt Flat Widow and start calling her, with a grudging respect he had not planned on, the sheep woman. It was the windmill. For 3 years, Della drew her water by hand and by a horse-walked windlass, bucket on bucket, and a flock cannot grow past what one woman can haul, so the flock had stalled around 140 head, watered hard, every drop pulled up by muscle. But the 4th spring, she had wool money enough finally, and she ordered a windmill, a real one, a tower and a fan and a pump and a length of well pipe, shipped up from the foundry catalogs to the railhead at Benson, and Lucius Ward hauled it out for her across the flat in 3 wagon loads, and she paid him the homesteader's rate to the penny. Putting up a windmill is a job for a crew of men, and Della did not have a crew of men. She had a 14-year-old boy named Eli Pruitt, and the Mexican herder Thomas, and a black dog, and herself, and over a brutal sweating week in the rising heat, they raised that tower bolt by bolt. On the 2nd day, working the block and tackle to lift the tower's first section, the rope slipped and the whole frame tilted, and Tomas lunged in and caught it with both hands over his head, while Della and Eli scrambled to reset the line. And for one long second, Thomas held 400 pounds of iron on his arms and grunted one Spanish word that sounded like a prayer, and then the section settled back onto the base, and they drove the bolts home in silence, sweating and white-lipped, nobody saying anything because there was nothing to say. On the 5th day, when at last the fan caught the wind and the pump rod started its long, slow stroke, and the first water came gushing up out of the pipe into the new stock tank with no hand on a windlass anywhere, Della Suttree sat down in the dirt and laughed, and Eli Pruitt whooped, and Thomas crossed himself, and the dog ran in circles barking at the spinning blades, and the salt flat had its first machine, and the machine never stopped. Day and night after that, the wind off the dragoons turned the fan, and the fan worked the pump, and the water came up sweet without a soul to draw it. And the flock that had stalled at 140 began to climb again, because now the only limit on the water was the wind, and in that dry country the wind never failed. This is the place I told you I might pause, so let me pause just long enough to say one thing to you directly. If you have stayed with Della Suttree this far, through the digging and the dead air and the winter and the windmill, then you already know what this story is, and you already know it is going to come out right, because the title told you so, and because some part of you needs it to. That is not a small thing to need. There is a lot of loud cruelty in the world, and there always has been, and there is a particular comfort, the comfort this channel is built on, in spending a couple of hours with a quiet person who was right when everyone said she was wrong. So, if that is the comfort you came for, do me the kindness back of telling me in the comments what town or city you are listening from, and whether there is a Della Suttree in your own life, somebody everyone underestimated who just kept going. I read everyone. Now back to the flat, because the worst year is still coming, and Della does not know it yet. The first person from town to find out about the water was a boy. His name was Eli Pruitt, and he was 12 years old, and he was the son of a homesteader off east of the flat. who had a quarter section of dry ground and a sick mother and a father who drank. Eli took to crossing Della's flat as a shortcut into town, and Della, who did not chase trespassers because she had no wish to draw attention, let him cross. And the boy got curious about the woman alone with the dog and the sheep. And one hot day in his crossing, he was near dead of thirst, because he had drunk his canteen dry. And Della, watching from the well paddock, did a thing she had not done in 5 years. She called him over, and she lifted a plank off the well, and she drew up a bucket of cold, sweet water, and she gave him a dipperful. And the boy drank it, and his eyes went wide, and he looked at her. "That's sweet," he said. "That's sweet water on the salt flat." He looked at the well, at the green fringe around the paddock, at the heavy, clean sheep, and he was a smart boy, and you could see him putting it together. "You found water," he said. "Everybody says there's no water on the flat. You found it." Della looked at the boy a long moment. She could have frightened him off. Instead of swearing him to secrecy, she made him a different offer. "I found it," she said, 41 feet down. Took me a year with a bucket." "Your mother sick?" The boy nodded. "She need clean water? Most of the wells east of here are gyp water, aren't they? Bitter. Bad for a sick stomach." The boy nodded again, slow, not understanding where she was going. "You bring me a clean barrel," Della said, "and you can fill it here every week for your mother. Sweet water, no charge, on one condition." She crouched down to his level and looked him in the eye. "You don't tell a soul in town where it came from, not yet. There are men in Bitter Wells who'd take this place off me the day they knew, and I've put 5 years in this ground. You let me get ready first? Can you keep a secret, Eli Pruitt?" And the boy, who had been given precious little in his life, and was being given clean water for his sick mother by the only adult who had ever looked at him straight, said yes, and he kept it. For another whole year he kept it, hauling his barrel across the flat once a week, and Della's water made his mother better, and Eli Pruitt became the first soul on earth who was loyal to Della Sutry, and he would not be the last. But secrets on a flat with 200 people watching cannot keep forever, and the man who broke it was Augustus Cray, and he broke it the way men like Cray break everything, by wanting it. It was a drought year, the 6th year, the worst the territory had seen in a generation. The rains failed in the winter and failed again in the spring, and by midsummer the San Pedro was a string of stagnant pools, and the grass on the open range north of town, Cray's range, was burned to gray stubble, and Cray's 4,000 head of cattle were dying. They died at the water holes, which went to mud and then to dust. They died walking, looking for water that was not there. A cattleman measures his life in his herd, and Augustus Cray watched his life die on the dry range that summer, and there was nothing his money or his bluster could do about it, because you cannot buy rain and you cannot buy water that is not there. By August, he had lost a third of his herd, and the rest were walking skeletons. And Augustus Cray, who had never in his life wanted anything he could not take, rode out across the country looking for water like a common drifter, and his looking brought him on a white, blinding afternoon to the edge of Della Sutry's salt flat. What Cray saw stopped him cold. He saw, in the middle of the cursed dead flat that he had laughed about for 6 years, a wide green island. He saw paddocks of standing saltbush and a windbreak of full-leafed cottonwoods 20 feet tall, and a flock of fat, clean sheep, hundreds of them, more than hundreds, grazing easy in the worst drought in living memory. And at the center of it all, a low stone well house and a windmill, its blades turning slow in the hot wind, pumping sweet water up out of the ground into a stock tank that gleamed full and blue under the killing sun. While his cattle died of thirst on the open range, the salt flat widow's sheep stood belly deep in feed beside a tank of water that did not end. Augustus Cray sat his horse at the edge of that flat, and he understood all at once and far too late that he had been the fool, that the joke had been on him for 6 years, that the worst land in the territory had sweet water under it, and the woman he had mocked in the mercantile had spent 6 years digging it out by hand while he laughed, and now, in the year that broke him, she stood there green and watered and rich while he was ruined. He should have ridden away and thought it over. He did not. Augustus Cray had never been able to want a thing and not reach for it, and the wanting was on him now like a fever. He rode straight in across the flat, past the windbreak, up to the well house where Della stood in her canvas coat with the black dog at her heel and her gray eyes already on him, because she had watched him come the whole long way across the white, and she knew exactly who he was and exactly what was about to happen. "Mrs. Suttree," Cray said, reining in. His voice was not the booming voice from the mercantile. It was a careful voice, a buying voice. "It appears I owe you an apology. I called this ground worthless. I see I was mistaken." He looked around at the green, at the tank, at the fat sheep, and he could not keep the hunger out of his face. "You got water." "I have," Della said. She did not offer him any. "My cattle are dying," Cray said. "You'll have heard. The whole range is dry. I've got near 3,000 head can't last another month without water." He paused, and you could see him doing the arithmetic of how to phrase it, how to make taking sound like giving. "I'd like to make you an offer, a fair one, more than fair. I'll buy this place from you, the whole 2,000 acres, water and all, and I'll pay you a price no sane person would turn down out here. $800 cash, in your hand, by Friday. That's a fortune for a woman alone, Mrs. Suttree. You could go back east and live like a lady. You could stop." He said the word stop like it was a gift. You could stop all this and rest. Now, I want you to picture this scene the way it happened, because this is the scene 6 years had been building toward, and Della Suttree kept her voice flat and gave him nothing extra, not a glowing word more than she needed to say. She stood by the well house, with her hand resting easy on the black dog's head, and she let Augustus Cray finish, and then she was quiet a moment, looking out across the green she had made out of nothing, and then she looked back at him. $800, she said. "That's a lot of money, Mr. Cray, I'll grant you that." She tilted her head. "Can I ask you something? 6 years ago, you stood in the mercantile and you told a roomful of men that I'd solved the problem of sheep ruining grass by buying ground that didn't have any. You remember that? You said it was the cleverest thing you ever heard." Cray's jaw worked. "Mrs. Suttree, that was a long time ago, and I've said I was—" "You were right," Della said, cutting him off, gentle. "That's the thing. You were exactly right. There's no grass on this flat, never has been. I didn't buy it for grass." She nodded out at the salt bush, at the sheep. "Sheep don't need grass. Sheep need salt and water and forage they can stand to eat. And this is the only place in the whole territory that's got the salt for free. And I'm the only one who took the trouble to find the water. You laughed at the one thing that made this place worth a fortune. You all did." She said it without heat, as if explaining weather. "So no, Mr. Cray, I won't sell you the water, not for $800 and not for $8,000. Your cattle are dying because cattle were the wrong animal for this country, and you were too proud to learn it. And I've spent 6 years learning it the hard way, and I'm not going to hand it to you on a Friday, so you can call me clever again." There was a silence on the flat. Buck had not moved, but a low sound was coming up out of him, felt more than heard. Augustus Cray sat his ruined horse, and his face went from buying to something else, something darker, the face of a man who has just been told no by a person he does not believe has the right to tell him no. "You'll regret that," Cray said, quiet. "A woman alone out here. There's taxes on this land. There's law about water rights, about who can hold what. You think a county judge is going to let one widow sit on the only sweet water in a drought while honest men's cattle die? You think you can keep this?" He gathered his reins. "I made you a fair offer, Mrs. Sutry. The next one won't be." "Then I'll see you with the next one," Della said. "Mind the dog on your way out." And Cray rode off across the white, and Della watched him the whole long way until he was a black speck against the dragoons. And then she sat down on the lip of the stock tank because her legs had gone watery now that it was over, and Buck pushed his head into her lap, and she sat there a long time in the hot wind. Because Cray was right about one thing. The law in the territory was made by men like Cray, for men like Cray, and a widow alone with the only water in a drought was a widow with a target on her back. The next blow came not from Cray directly, but from Horace Pell, the banker, which was how men like that worked, never their own hand on the knife. 2 weeks after Cray's visit, a rider came out to the flat with an envelope, and the envelope was a notice from the county that the taxes on Della's 2,000 acres had been reassessed. For 6 years, she had paid a few dollars a year in tax on worthless salt flat, paid it scrupulous and on time, because she knew that a missed tax payment was the easiest way in the world for the land to be taken. But now, the notice said, the county assessor had determined that the Sutry property was no longer waste land. It was improved land, watered land, with a producing well and a windmill and fences and a green field and a flock of 240 sheep, and it was hereby assessed at a value of $3,000, and the tax due upon it, payable within 60 days, was $210. $210. Della read the notice 3 times. She had money, more than the town guessed, money from 6 years of wool clips sold quiet at Benson, but she did not have that sum loose, not in the dry middle of a drought year with her own expenses mounting, and the assessor knew that, and Horace Pell knew that, because Horace Pell was the man who advised the county assessor and held a seat on the very board that set the rates. 60 days. It was a number set to break her. They had done the arithmetic the same way she had done the arithmetic on her well, foot by foot, and they had figured she could not raise that bill in time, and when she could not, the land would go to a tax sale, and at a tax sale in Bitterwells there would be exactly one bidder with cash in hand, and his name would be Augustus Cray, and he would get the whole flat and all its water for the price of the bill and a clear conscience, because the law would have done it, not him. 60 days. Della wrote it on the inside of the tent flap under the old 60 that had been the depth of the well, and she began to cross the days off one at a time, and this time the falling number was not feet of clay between her and the water. This time it was days between her and losing everything. 58 days, 51, 44, the same numbers as the well almost, and she was not blind to it. And some nights it felt like the territory was making her dig the same hole twice. Now, here's where the story turns, and it turns on the thing Della had been doing for 6 years without ever once thinking of it as an investment. It turns on the people, because Della Suttree, who told the town nothing, had quietly, over 6 years, become the one decent thing on that whole stretch of dry country, and she had not even noticed she was doing it. There was Eli Pruitt, of course, the boy whose sick mother she had given sweet water to for 2 years running, who was 14 now, and worked her shearing every spring for wages and worshipped the ground she walked on. But there was more than Eli. There was the Mexican herder at Benson, Thomas, who had sold her buck, and who she had hired 3 springs running for the lambing, because he was the best hand with sheep in the territory, and the cattlemen would not have a Mexican on their place. And she paid him in coin, and treated him like a man. And Thomas had told every herder from Benson to Tombstone that the Salt Flat woman was straight. There was the widow Gantry in town, who took in laundry and was looked down on, and to whom Della had carried every single time she came in for supplies a side of clean mutton and a crock of well water, asking nothing. There was old Doc Faraday, who had set a broken arm for a lambing hand of hers, and whom Della had paid in wool and friendship, and who had said more than once that Della Suttree's flock was the only livestock in the county that never came to him sick. There were the homesteaders east of the flat, a dozen dry land families scratching at quarter sections, to whom Della, in the worst of the drought, had quietly opened her water. She had run a pipe and a second tank to the east fence and put up a sign that said, "Clean water, take what you need," and through the killing summer those families had watered their gardens and their milk cows and their children from Della Suttree's well, and not one of them had ever paid her a cent, because she had never asked, and not one of them had forgotten it. The day she opened her water to the East End is worth telling whole, because it was not a grand gesture. Della never thought of it as one. It was the worst week of the drought, the 7th year, the dry land gardens curling brown, and the homesteaders' wells gone to jib and bitter alkali that gave the children the flux. Della was at her east fence mending wire when the Reyes girl came across the burned ground on a bare-backed mule, a thin child of 9 or 10, sent by her mother, and she sat the mule at Della's fence too shy to speak until Della went over to her. "What is it, child?" Della said. The girl's lip trembled. "My mama says, is it true? The men in town say you got sweet water. My baby brother's sick from the well water. Mama says she'll trade you. She'll trade you her good shawl, the one from Mexico, for 2 barrels of your sweet water for the baby." And the child held up in both hands a folded shawl, worked all over with red and gold thread, plainly the best thing the family owned, the thing a poor woman keeps wrapped in paper at the bottom of a trunk against the day she has nothing else to give. "You take that shawl back to your mother," Della said, "and you tell her to keep it, because I don't trade water to sick babies." She walked the girl on the mule down the fence to where the windmill pipe ran, and she ran a length of it through the wire to a second tank she filled on the spot. And she said, "This tank stays full from here on. Any family on the East End, you water your stock and your gardens and your young ones here, drought or no drought, and you don't bring me a thing for it, not a shawl, and not a chicken, and not a day's work, because water isn't a thing a person ought to sell to a neighbor who's dry. You tell them all that. Della Sutree's east tank is open, and she hung a board on the fence that said, in her own square hand, clean water, take what you need, and she meant it. And through the killing heart of that drought, the families of the East End watered their children at Della Sutree's tank, and the Reyes baby lived, and not one of those families ever forgot the day the Salt Flat widow handed a shawl back to a frightened child, and opened her well to the whole dry country, and asked nothing. She did not know she was building anything. She thought she was just doing what a person does. But Bitter Wells, the town that ran on Augustus Cray's cattle and Horace Pell's loans, had grown underneath itself a second town, a town of people who owed Della Sutree their water and their wages and their dignity. And when the tax notice came, that second town began quietly to move. It was Eli Pruitt who brought her the word, riding hard across the flat one evening with 40 days left on the tent flap. He had been in town. He had heard. He told her, breathless, what the men at the Drovers' Rest were saying, that the tax sale was set, that Cray was telling everyone he would have the Salt Flat by fall, that Pell had the paper all drawn up. And then Eli told her the other thing, the thing that made Della Sutree set down the bucket she was holding and stand very still. "They're not going to let him," Eli said. "Doc Faraday, the widow Gantry. My pa he quit drinking near a year on your account, says he'd be dead in a ditch if your water hadn't pulled my ma through. Thomas, the Hardin family and the Olsons and the Reyes off the East End, all of them you watered through the dry. They're talking, Mrs. Sutree. They're saying it isn't right. They're saying Cray and Pell aren't going to steal your water with a tax bill while the whole town stands and watches." The boy's eyes were shining. "Doc Faraday says there's a way. A tax sale's a public auction. Anybody can bid. Doc says if folks put in together, if everybody that owes you puts in what they can, we can buy it ourselves at the sale and hand it right back to you, and there's not a thing Cray can do, because the law that's supposed to take it from you is the same law that lets us outbid him." Della stood in the door of her tent with the sun going down red over the dragoons, and she could not, for a moment, speak. For 6 years she had believed she was alone. She had built that belief into the foundation of everything she did, told no one her secret, trusted no one with the water, carried the whole weight of 2,000 acres on her own back, because she was certain that the world was a place where a woman alone got taken. And now a 14-year-old boy was standing in her tent door, telling her that the world had been keeping count of her kindnesses the same way she had been keeping count of her debts, and that the account was about to come due in her favor. "How much?" she said finally, her voice not quite steady. "How much do they think they can raise?" Eli shook his head. "Doc didn't know yet. He's going around. But Mrs. Sutree—" The boy hesitated. "It's $210. That's a lot. The folks that love you out here, they're poor folks, dry land folks. Doc's worried. Cray's got cash. Cray can stand up at that sale and bid the opening amount without blinking, and bid 304. We might raise 100. We might raise more. But Cray's got the deepest pockets in the county, and a tax sale goes to the highest bidder, and—" The boy stopped, because he did not want to say the rest, which was that love does not always beat money, not in Bitter Wells, not in the Territory, not most places. Della was quiet a long moment. Then she did a thing that surprised even her. She started to laugh. Not a bitter laugh, a real one, the first real laugh in a long time, because she had just seen the whole shape of it, the whole beautiful arithmetic of it, and she understood that Augustus Cray, who had ruined himself running cattle on dry ground because he was too proud to learn, was about to ruin himself a second time, the exact same way. "He won't have the cash," Della said. "Eli, listen to me. Augustus Cray lost a third of his herd this summer, and the rest aren't worth the price of the bullet to put them down. He's land poor and cattle poor, and the bank's got paper on him, same as everybody. He's been telling the town he'll buy the flat because telling the town a thing is how a man like Cray makes it true. But the man hasn't got the money loose any more than I have. He's bluffing. He's been bluffing since the day he rode out here and offered me $800 he never had, because a man like that, the offer is the lie, and the lie is the whole game." She wiped her eyes. "We don't have to outbid Augustus Cray, Eli. We just have to make him show his hand, and then we have to have a little more than he does, which means—" And here she stopped laughing and got very still and practical, the way she got when she was figuring a thing, "which means it isn't about whether the dry land folks can raise the full tax amount against Cray's fortune. It's about whether they can raise a little more than a ruined man can actually put on the table. And that, Eli Pruitt, is a number we might be able to reach." But she was not going to gamble everything on Cray bluffing. Della Sutry had not survived 6 years on the salt flat by trusting that the other man would fold. So that night she sat by her fire and she made a different plan, a harder one, a sure one, and it cost her the thing she had guarded most carefully for 6 years, which was secrecy. She had money. She had, hidden in a strong box buried under the floor of the well house, the savings of 6 wool clips sold quiet at Benson, a little over $300 in gold and silver coin, more money than anyone in Bitter Wells imagined a salt flat widow could have. She had hidden it because hidden money is safe money. But hidden money does not buy land back at a public auction. And the moment she stood up at that tax sale and bid her own $300, the whole town would know she was not a half-starved fool, but a woman of means, and the knowing would change everything, and there would be no putting the secret back in the box. For a long time that night she turned it over, and then she understood that the secrecy had never really been the point. The secrecy had been a wall she built when she was alone and afraid, and she was not alone anymore. And a wall you do not need anymore is just a thing that keeps the light out. So she decided she would go to the sale. She would let the dry land folks raise what they could raise, every dollar of it, not because she needed their money, but because they needed to give it, because a gift refused is an insult, and these people loved her and had a right to stand with her. And then, if Cray was bluffing, the folks' money would carry it, and she would never have to show her own hand. And if Cray was not bluffing, if he stood up with real cash, then Della Sutry would open her buried strongbox in front of God and Augustus Cray and the whole town of Bitter Wells, and she would outbid him to the last coin, and the secret would be out, and let it be out. She had hidden long enough. The 30 days came down. On the tent flap, the number fell 29, 22, 15, and through those days the second town of Bitter Wells did a thing the first town had never seen. Doc Faraday went house to house with a cigar box. The widow Gantry put in $4 she could not spare. money saved coin by coin from laundry. Eli Pruitt's father, sober a year on Della's water, put in $11 in the gold ring that had been his dead wife's, and Doc would not take the ring, and made him take it home. Tomas the herder rode in from Benson with $22 in silver and the word that 4 other herders had sent their wages along with him. The Hardens and the Olsons and the Reyes families, who had watered their children through the drought at Della's East Tank, put in everything they had that was not flour and seed, $8 here and 5 there, and a milk cow the Reyes offered that Doc converted to $19 cash by selling it to the butcher that same afternoon. Old Doc Faraday himself put in $50, the largest single sum, and would not let anyone talk about it. And by the night before the sale, the cigar box held $141 and some odd cents, raised entirely by the poorest people in the county, every coin of it a debt of gratitude paid back to a woman who had never once sent a bill. $141. It was not the tax amount. Everyone knew it was not enough to carry the sale alone. Doc Faraday brought the box out to the flat the evening before the sale and set it on Della's table and told her the number. Ashamed, certain it was not enough. And Della looked at the box of grimy, hard-earned coins, at the laundry money and the herder's silver and the dead wife's ring that Doc had put back in over the man's protest after all, because the man had insisted, and Della Sutry, who had not cried when her husband died and had not cried in 6 years on the salt flat, put her face in her hands at her own table and wept, because no one had ever given her anything in her whole life, and now the poorest people in the county had emptied their pockets for her, and it did not matter in the least that it was not enough. It was the most money she had ever seen, and the least important sum in the story, and she knew it, and she could not say it. So she just wept, and Doc Faraday patted her shoulder and looked away, and outside the dog Buck whined at the door at the sound of her crying. When she had wept herself out, she lifted her head and looked at Doc Faraday across the little table, the old man turning his hat in his hands, not knowing what to do with a crying woman, and she did a thing then that she had not done with a single soul in 6 years. She told him the truth, all of it. She got up, and she went, and she pried up the floorboard of the well house, and she carried the strong box in and set it on the table next to the cigar box. And she opened it, and Doc Faraday looked at 6 years of wool money lying in the lamplight, gold on silver, more than $300, and his old jaw came open. "Della," he said, "girl, you've had this all along. You don't need our $141. You could buy that flat back twice over and never miss it. Why in God's name did you let those poor folks empty their pockets? The Reyes selling a milk cow, the gantry woman's laundry money." He stopped because Della was shaking her head, slow. "Listen to me, Doc," she said, and her voice was steady now, scraped clean by the crying. "If I'd stood up 6 years ago and said I had money, you know what would have happened to this place. Pell and Cray would have found a way to take it, a lien, a claim, a law. Men like that always find the way, and a woman alone can't fight all the ways at once. The secret was the only wall I had. But that's not why I let the folks raise their box." She put her hand flat on the grimy cigar box, on the laundry coins and the herder's silver. "I let them raise it because they needed to. Do you understand? Every one of those people has been carried by somebody their whole lives, looked down on, charity-cased, the Gantry widow, and Thomas, who they won't have on a white man's place, and the Reyes that the town treats like they're not there. For 6 years I've been carrying them, water and mutton and wages, and a person carried and never able to carry back. That's not a friend, Doc. That's a burden, and it shames them even when they love you for it. Tomorrow, for once, they get to carry me. They get to stand up in that street and be the ones who saved somebody. I'd not take that from them for all the gold under this floor. So we use their box first, every cent. And only if Cray's not bluffing do I open mine. And if I open mine, it'll be because they put me in reach of it. And that's a truer thing than them never having tried. She closed the strong box. Now go home and sleep, Doc, and don't you tell a living soul what's under this floor, because tomorrow I mean to surprise the whole town of Bitter Wells, and I've waited 6 years for it. And Doc Faraday, who had set bones in that country for 40 years and thought he had seen every person there was, looked at Della Suttree a long moment in the lamplight, and then he put on his hat, and he said, "Mrs. Suttree, I have been wrong about a great many people in my life, but I was never so glad to be wrong as I am about you." And he went home, and he kept her secret, and he did not sleep at all. The tax sale was held on the steps of the county building in Bitter Wells on a bright, cold morning in late October, and it seemed the whole territory had come to see it. Word had got around, the way word does, that the Salt Flat widow's water was up for grabs, and that Augustus Cray meant to have it, and that the dry land folks meant to fight him for it. And so there was a crowd on the street such as Bitter Wells had not seen since the railroad survey came through. Cattlemen and homesteaders and town folk and herders, the two towns of Bitter Wells standing in the same street for once and eyeing each other. Horace Pell stood on the steps in a black coat with the auctioneer beside him and the deed papers in a leather folder. Augustus Cray stood at the front of the crowd in his good hat with two of his riders behind him, and he looked, Della thought, watching from the edge of the crowd with Doc Faraday and Eli on one side and Thomas on the other, like a man who had told a lie so many times he had come to believe it. Della stood at the edge of the crowd and made herself breathe slow, and she let her eyes go over the two towns of Bitter Wells gathered in one street. On the one side, near the steps, stood Cray's men and the cattle interest and the town folk, who took their cue from money, well-fed, sure of the outcome, a few of them already smiling the way you smile at a thing that is settled. On the other side, drawn together near Doc Faraday and his cigar box, stood the dry land folks in their patched coats, the Hardens and the Olsons and the Reyes, with the mother who had sent the shawl, Thomas and 3 other herders in from Benson with their hats in their hands, the widow Gantry with her chin up for once in her life, and Eli Pruitt's father standing sober and pale beside his boy. They had come knowing they would likely lose. That was the thing that caught at Della's throat as she looked at them. They had counted the box, and they knew it was $141 against a rich man's purse. And they had come anyway, dressed in their best, to stand up in the open and be counted on her side and to lose in the open if they had to. Because some things you do not, because you will win, but because a person you love is about to be robbed, and you will not let it happen with you sitting home. Della looked at them, and she put her hand on the canvas sack under her coat, the sack heavy with 6 years of buried wool money, and she thought, "You are not going to lose today, none of you. You just don't know it yet." And she had to look away at the mountains for a moment to keep her face still. The auctioneer read out the property. 2,000 acres, the Suttree Salt Flat, sold for delinquent taxes in the amount of $210. Opening bid to be the amount of the taxes due. Sale to the highest bidder. Cash on the barrelhead, no terms, no paper. The county would not carry a note. That last was Pell's own rule, and it was meant to favor Cray, who everyone believed had cash, and to crush the dry land folks, who everyone knew had only their cigar box. Della had counted on it being meant that way. She had counted on Pell and Cray being so sure of their own arithmetic that they would never imagine a widow had arithmetic of her own. "Do I hear the opening bid?" the auctioneer called. $210 for the Sutry place, water and all. Augustus Cray's voice came up big and confident across the street, the mercantile voice, the voice that filled a room. 210, he said, and he smiled and looked around at the crowd, and the smile said, "This is over. You have all wasted your morning. The Salt Flat is mine." And then Doc Faraday, before Della could stop him, because the old man's blood was up, and he could not bear to let it pass without a fight, even a losing one, stepped forward with the cigar box held against his chest and called out in his cracked old voice, $141.60, and it's every cent the honest poor of this county could raise, and shame on you, Augustus Cray, shame on you and Horace Pell both. The crowd made a noise. The auctioneer looked pained. "Doctor, the opening bid is 210. I can't take 141 against 210. The bid's got to advance past the taxes due. You know that." "It's all we have," Doc said, and his old voice broke on it, and the dry land folks behind him made a low sound, and Augustus Cray laughed out loud, the same laugh from the mercantile 6 years before, the laugh that had named Della Sutry a fool in front of the whole town, and it was that laugh, that exact laugh, that put Della Sutry in motion. She stepped out of the crowd. She walked up to the front, past Doc, past Eli, and she stood at the bottom of the county steps in her husband's canvas coat with the black dog at her heel, and the street went quiet because nobody had expected the woman herself to bid. A woman had nothing to bid with. Everyone knew that. Augustus Cray looked down at her from his confidence and his good hat, and he said, almost kindly, the way you speak to someone who has embarrassed herself, "Now, Mrs. Sutry, there's no call for this. The bidding's a man's business, and the price is past you. Go on home." Della did not go home. She sat down on the bottom step, a canvas sack she had carried in under her coat, and she untied the throat of it, and she reached in and brought out, in front of the whole town of Bitter Wells, a double handful of gold and silver coin, 6 years of wool clips sold quiet at Benson, and she let it run back into the sack with a sound that every soul on that street heard and understood. The unmistakable heavy chime of real money, a great deal of real money, more money than anyone had dreamed the Salt Flat widow possessed. $225, Della said, not loud. The street had gone so quiet you could hear the windmill turning 1.5 miles out on the flat. The auctioneer's mouth opened and shut. Horace Pell went the color of paper, and Augustus Cray's face, his big sunburned, confident face, did a thing the whole crowd watched it do, which was that it stopped believing its own lie. Because the bid was at $225 now, and it was real. It was sitting in a sack on the courthouse step with the gold showing, and the auctioneer was already turning to Cray and saying, "The bid is $225 against you, Mr. Cray. Do you advance?" And the whole street had turned to look at Augustus Cray, and Augustus Cray had to put up or fold, cash on the barrelhead, no terms, no paper, his own ally's rule, And Augustus Cray did not have it. He had lost a third of his herd. The bank had his paper. He had been telling the town he would buy the flat the same way he told the mercantile that Della Sutry was a fool, because telling the town a thing was how a man like Cray made it true. And now the telling had run out, and the cash was on the step, and it was not his cash, and it never had been. "Do you advance, Mr. Cray?" the auctioneer said again. The silence stretched. Cray's jaw worked. He looked at the sack of gold, and he looked at the crowd that was watching him, and he looked for one moment at Della Sutry standing small and steady at the bottom of the steps, with her dog and her dead husband's coat, and whatever he saw in her gray eyes, it was not a fool. He had to say something. The whole street was waiting, and so Augustus Cray, the biggest man in the county, did the only thing left to a man whose bluff has been called in front of everyone he ever ruled. 250, he said, and the words came out cracked, and everyone heard the crack, and it was the worst mistake he ever made, because now the lie had to become money, and the money was not there. 250 to Mr. Cray, the auctioneer said, almost desperate. 250, do you advance, Mrs. Sutry? Della reached into the sack. She did not hurry. She counted out onto the courthouse step. In stacks the whole street could see, gold coin on gold coin. And when she had counted past 250, she kept counting, slow and steady, the chime of it the only sound in Bitter Wells, until she had laid down a sum no one could mistake and no one could match. $300, Della Sutry said, cash, on the step, right now. And she looked up at Augustus Cray, and she said the only hard thing she said that whole day, said it quiet, without heat, the way she had told him no by the well house. Do you advance, Mr. Cray? And Augustus Cray could not advance, because Augustus Cray did not have $300, did not have 250, had never had it. And the whole town of Bitter Wells understood in that moment, all at once, that the man who had laughed at the Salt Flat widow for 6 years was broke, that the cattle empire was dead on the dry range, that the booming voice from the mercantile had been a bluff stretched over an empty bank, and that the only person on the street with real money in her hands was the woman they had all agreed could not last a season. Cray opened his mouth and nothing came out. He looked at his two riders, and they looked at the ground. He looked at Horace Pell, and Pell would not meet his eye, because Pell held Cray's paper, and Pell knew to the dollar exactly how broke Augustus Cray was, had known all along, had drawn up the tax sale not to help Cray win the flat, but on the chance Cray could, and now that Cray could not, Horace Pell was already behind his paper face, calculating how to be on the other side of this. Going once, the auctioneer said, and you could hear the relief in it, the eagerness to be done. $300 to Mrs. Sutry, going twice. A pause, and the whole street holding its breath, and Augustus Cray standing frozen with his ruin showing on his face for everyone to see. Sold to Mrs. Della Sutry for $300, the Sutry salt, flat, water, and all, free and clear. For a moment there was no sound at all, and then the second town of Bitter Wells, the dry land folks and the herders, and the widow Gantry and Doc Faraday with his cigar box still clutched to his chest, made a noise that started low and came up into a roar, a cheer such as that street had never heard, and Eli Pruitt was jumping and shouting, and Thomas had his hat in the air, and even some of the town folk who owed Della nothing were cheering, because everyone loves to see a bluff called and a proud man brought down, and a decent person win, and Della Suttree stood at the bottom of the county steps in the middle of all of it, with the deed to her own land in her hand for the second time, and the gold still chiming in the sack, and the black dog leaning hard against her leg, and she neither cheered nor gloated. She bent down and gathered her remaining coins back into the sack with steady hands, and she straightened up, and she looked for one last moment at Augustus Cray. Cray was already turning away. There was nothing for him on that street any more. The crowd's cheering was a wall he had to walk through to get to his horse, and he walked through it with his good hat down and his shoulders down, and the 6 years of laughter all come home to roost on him at once. And as he passed Della, she said one thing to him, the last thing she ever said to him, and she said it quiet enough that only he could hear, and it was not cruel. "You weren't wrong about the land, Mr. Cray," she said. "You were just wrong about me. Most people were. Mind how you go." And Augustus Cray got on his horse and rode out of Bitter Wells, and the story does not follow him because he is not the point. He went north and sold what cattle he had left for a fraction of nothing, and the bank took his range, and within 2 years he was a hired man on another man's outfit down near the border. And the only thing left of his empire was the story the cowhands told about the Salt Flat widow who broke him at a tax sale with 6 years of wool money, and even they telling it were on her side. Now I want to give you the after, because the Channel's promise is a warm and settled close, and Della Suttree earned hers down to the last foot of clay. She kept the Salt Flat, of course, free and clear, and she paid the $210 in taxes that very afternoon with money from the same sack, and she made a point of paying it to Horace Pell's own clerk, so that Horace Pell would have to record it in his own hand, and she paid the next year's taxes a year early on top of it, so that no reassessment trick would ever again come down on her in 60 days. And then she did the thing that turned a vindication into a legacy, the thing that made Bitter Wells in the end love her instead of merely respecting her. She gave the water away, not the land. She was not a fool. The land and the flock and the well were hers and stayed hers. But the water, the deep, sweet, endless water under the Salt Flat, she made it the county's. She went to Doc Faraday and to the dry land families, and she proposed, and they helped her draw it up legal so that Horace Pell could never undo it, a water right that ran with her land but pledged it forever to the homesteads of the East End, a standing covenant that any family within 10 miles of the flat could water their stock and their gardens and their children from the Suttree well in any year, drought or plenty, for as long as the well ran, and that the well would be maintained out of a fund she seeded with $50 of the wool money, and that the dry land folks would tend in common. The widow, with $11 who had been told she would not last a season, took the single most valuable thing in the territory, the only sweet water in a drought country, and she made it belong to the poorest people in the county. And she did it not because she was a saint, but because she had learned the one thing Augustus Cray never learned, which is that a fortune you hoard makes you a target, and a fortune you share makes you a town. And Della Suttree, who had been alone for 6 years, never meant to be alone again. The flock grew to 2,000 head over the years that followed, and then past it. The wool from the Suttree Salt Flat became known from Benson to Tombstone as the cleanest clip in the territory, heavy and white, and free of the burr and rot that spoiled the bottomland wool. And buyers came to her now, drove out across the white flat to the green island in the middle of it to deal for her wool before it was even sheared, and she sold it for top dollar and never once sold it through Bitter Wells, though Bitter Wells by then had stopped being a town that mocked her and become a town that bragged about her. The cottonwood windbreak grew to 40 feet and threw shade across the well house. The salt bush spread until a quarter of the flat carried forage, and the green fringe around the paddocks widened year on year, sheep and water and time turning the dead salt slowly into living ground exactly as she had known it would, 1 acre at a time, the way she did everything. Folks stopped calling it the Salt Flat. They started calling it the Suttree Range, and then, after a while, just Suttrees. The way you name a thing that has become a fixture of the country, and a child born in Bitter Wells in those years grew up not knowing the flat had ever been worthless, knowing only that out south of town there was the richest sheep range in the territory and a woman named Della who ran it, and that you could water your stock there free in a dry year, and that was just the way the world was and always had been. Eli Pruitt grew up, and Della took him on as her foreman, and then, when she was old, as near a son as a woman who never had children could have, and he ran Suttrees after her, and kept the water covenant his whole life, and his children kept it after him. Tomas the herder came to work for her permanent, and built a house at the East End, and the cattlemen, who would not have a Mexican on their place, watched the best sheep outfit in the territory run on his skill and said nothing. The widow Gantry stopped taking in laundry because Della made her the keeper of the well fund and paid her a real wage to tend the books of the water covenant. And the widow Gantry, who had been looked down on her whole life, ended it a person of standing in the county, all because she had once put $4 she could not spare into a cigar box. For a woman who had carried her mutton and well water and asked nothing. Doc Faraday lived long enough to see the flat go green, and he liked to say in the drover's rest of an evening that he had practiced medicine in that country for 40 years, and the healthiest thing he ever saw was not a person at all, but a flock of sheep on a salt flat. And the only thing healthier than the sheep was the town that grew up around the woman who ran them. There is one last thing worth telling, because it happened the spring after the tax sale, and it shows you what Della Suttree was made of when she had nothing left to prove. Sheffield, the wool buyer, came out to the flat that spring, the fat, shrewd man from the Boston house, the one who had laughed at her on the Benson platform and then bought her clip when he saw the quality. He came in a hired buggy, which told you he was not on a casual errand, and he drove across the flat to the well house and got down and introduced himself as if they had never met, which was a thing buyers did when they wanted to pretend the terms were equal. "Mrs. Suttree," he said, pulling off his hat, "I've been hearing things about this range that I want to see for myself. A man on the platform at Benson says there's 2,000 head of the cleanest sheep in the territory out here, and the wool goes at a premium nobody else can touch. I'd like to offer you a contract, not a one-time sale. A standing arrangement, 2 clips a year, my house in Boston, a guaranteed floor price, and no more standing on a platform in the wind making buyers bid against each other." He named a number that was more than she had ever been paid, but less than she could get at the open platform, and he said it with the confidence of a man offering a favor. Della looked at him a moment. Then she walked him through the paddocks, past the flock, past the windmill and the stock tank, and the green salt bush that went on farther than he had expected. She kept quiet, just let him see it. And when they got back to the well house, she turned and looked at him. "You laughed at me in the Benson platform," she said. "3 years ago I shook out a fleece, and you laughed and said, 'There's no wool grows on a salt flat.'" Sheffield had the grace to look sideways. "That was before I knew what—" "Before you knew what I knew," Della said. "Yes. So here's what I'll do, Mr. Sheffield. I'll give you the first contract on each clip for the price I got at last auction. Not a floor, not a guaranteed number. The price the market set. You take it by the 22nd of August each year, you get first right of refusal. You don't take it, I take it back to the platform." She tilted her head. "That's a better deal than the platform because you won't have to bid against anyone, but it's only better if you're straight, and a man who laughs before he's looked at the wool is a man I'm going to want to watch." Sheffield stood there a moment, and then he put his hat back on, and he stuck out his hand. "August 22nd, he said. "Done." And that was how the Sutry contract was made on terms Della named, in the shade of cottonwood she had planted herself, on ground she had bought for $11 from a man who pitied her. And it ran for 22 years and never once missed the August deadline, and Sheffield told the story in Boston boardrooms until the end of his life, the story of the woman on the salt flat who would not be laughed at twice, and the men in those boardrooms laughed, and Sheffield telling it was always on her side. As for Della Sutry herself, she lived out her life on the salt flat she had been told would break her, and she grew old there, gray-haired and slow but never once idle, walking her green range at dawn the same way she had walked the white one, looking for water, and she was, by every account that came down, content. She had buried Tom Sutry's debt and Tom Sutry's dream both, paid the one and built the other into a thing he could never have imagined, and on the clearest mornings she would walk out to the center of the flat where the windmill turned and the stock tank gleamed full and blue, the very spot where she had driven a stake with a strip of red flannel on it 20 years before, and allowed herself to hope. And she would stand there in the cool of the dawn with the whole green range spreading out around her and the dragoons going gold behind it. And she would say, sometimes, out loud, to a husband 20 years in the ground, "The salt bush is spreading, Tom. The lambs came clean. The water held." And it did. The water held. Long after Della Sutry was gone, the well on the salt flat ran sweet, and the covenant held, and the families of the East End watered their children from it generation on generation, and the richest sheep range in the territory stayed rich. And the town that had said a widow with $11 would not last a season learned, the hard, slow way a hard country learns anything, that the most worthless ground in the world is only worthless until somebody is patient enough to find out why, and that the surest fortune a person can build is not the one they dig out of the ground alone, but the one they give away to a town that will remember them for it. They said the salt flat would break her. It made her the richest sheep range in the territory, and it made the territory better for having had her in it, and there is not a better ending than that. Not anywhere, not in any country I know. So if you stayed with Della all the way to the end of her green range, I hope you got the same thing out of it I did, which is the plain, stubborn comfort of watching a good person be right when the whole world bet against her. Tell me in the comments what town or city you listened from, and whether you knew somebody like Della, somebody everybody underestimated who just kept her head down and proved them all wrong. I love reading those. And if this is a story you want more of, The one where the worthless thing turns out to be the whole secret and the quiet person turns out to be the strongest one in the room. Then stay with me, because I have got a great many more of them to tell, and every one of them is true to the only thing that matters, which is that patience and decency, given enough hard ground and enough time, will outlast every loud man who ever laughed.